Everyone knows how Roberto De Zerbi's teams attack, but can he fix Tottenham's defence? And can he keep them in the Premier League? Well, to delve into this, we've got Alex Barker, Jack Pitt-Brooke, and John Mackenzie. Well, Jack, Roberto De Zerbi, many know of his expansive football, but I've never really seen him as a firefighter. Can you just give us any glimpses as to how Tottenham got to the decision to make him their head coach?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting distinction. So Tottenham have been interested in him for a long time. I think Spurs, they've been thinking about him during the course of this season. Even, when Thomas Frank was still the manager and when De Zerbi was still at Marseille, I think the Spurs were interested in possibly getting him. The timing didn't line up. They ended up going for Igor Tudor. Obviously that didn't work. He only had a few league games. Spurs had been trying through the course of this time to get De Zerbi in. I think ideally they would have had him in sooner. They've only got him now with 7 games left in the season. But I think what's so interesting about it is under different circumstances, it would be such an exciting appointment because he plays this kind of cutting edge brand of football. But it's very unusual for teams who are desperately trying to stay in the Premier League to go for a cutting-edge appointment. Like generally, you would go for somebody who is going to guarantee you hard work, clean sheets, simple football, set pieces, and just try and scrape your way to whatever it's 35, 38, 40 points. So I've been picking my brains in the last few weeks trying to come up with a precedent of a team going for such a progressive appointment when they're in a relegation scrap, and I cannot think of one. And that's what makes it so interesting.
Well, let's delve into some of his qualities. Let's go back a little bit. Let's learn about what he did in Marseille in just under 2 years. I mean, he started off pretty well, but it unravelled slightly towards the end, didn't it?
Well, you've come to the right place because I spent last summer binge watching De Zerbi's Marseille from the previous season. And from watching them, I've got 2 main points that I really want to hammer home here. The first is what De Zerbi's teams are like in possession. And when I say that, we tend to think of this 4-2-3-1 where De Zerbi's teams bait the press, lure opponents forward, and if the opponents don't come forward, if they sit back in a low block, well, then De Zerbi's teams lose. That's a stereotype at least, right? But I think his time at Marseille kind of disproves that. So while he did start in this 4-2-3-1 shape, a few games in, he actually switched to a back 3. Now, I think the reason he switched to this system was because he wanted Marseille to possess the ball a bit further forward, higher up the pitch, and pin opponents in a bit more, rather than just baiting the press. And I think he wanted to allow a bit more fluidity in his team. Certainly on the right-hand side, where you had the right winger, the right wing back, and the right centre-back, all allowed to push forward and rotate to pull opponents apart. And I have to say, it did work. De Zerbi's Marseille were really impressive last season. If you just look at the numbers, they ranked second for possession. I've highlighted second as if it's first because when you're in a league with PSG, second is as good as first sometimes. Second for goals and third for expected goals. They created a lot of chances and scored some fantastic goals. However, last summer, Marseille started to create problems for themselves. They sold 4 players in the top 10 for minutes in Ligue 1 last season, Luis Enrique being a particularly key player on the right-hand side. And in their place came a boatload of first-team players. They don't actually all fit on one page, but even just looking through the list, you've got Benjamin Pavard, Matt O'Reilly, Angel Gomez. That's 3 players immediately who'd be expecting to start. And even after those guys, you've got 3 more summer signings like Aubameyang and then 4 winter signings, including Akinwolere. And this made a real impact on how De Zerbi could use his squad. These charts show the proportion of minutes a player played across the season. And you can see last year, De Zerbi was able to rely on basically the same starting 11, more or less week in, week out. And without Champions League football, he had basically all week, every week to coach these players with his methods. And that really did show. Like I said, Marseille were very impressive, certainly on the ball last season. But this season, you can see in the chart that there are fewer players towards the top and bottom and more around the middle. Marseille had Champions League football, they had to rotate more, and I think the result of that was De Zerbi had less time to train his players and more new players to train. And I think that's reflected in what happened this season because, well, last year, if you look at this XG timeline, you can see last season there's a peak here where Marseille were putting up PSG level attack, right? And it drops down towards this season. Still, I do want to say, I think with Marseille in possession, you don't need to have many concerns. If you're a Tottenham fan, I think De Zerbi largely disproved the stereotype about him that's come up from Brighton. The one thing we do need to talk about though, which was hinted in the intro, but not spoken about here and not really spoken about much elsewhere, because when we talk about De Zerbi, it's so easy to talk about the delightful football on the ball. We need to talk about what his team are like off the ball. How did De Zerbi's Marseille defend? The answer to that question is pretty badly. While it might not look like it on this chart because the blue line is so high up and above the red line, look a bit more closely, you see the red line, the XG against, is actually consistently in line or above 1 expected goal against per 90 or per game. What does that look like in practice? Well, across across De Zerbi's tenure, Marseille conceded over 80 expected goals. That was, I'd say, the worst tally amongst Ligue 1's top sides, and it was nearly 30 expected goals more than PSG. So while it's really fun to talk about De Zerbi's teams with the ball, what we need to put under the microscope is what his teams are like without the ball.
Okay, well, let's do that right now. Let's talk about the defence, John. What did he try to do, mainly, but also what went wrong with it?
I think the most important thing to talk about here is the structure to start with. I think what you see from De Zerbi is actually quite a modern approach to out-of-possession play. One of the things we talk about a lot here is a sort of hybrid approach to defending, where you're going to try and use man-to-man principles when the opposition are trying to build up. But once that press is broken, you would then expect to see them dropping in and forming a bit more of a zonal approach. So being more compact, not necessarily worrying about going man-to-man everywhere and making it hard for the opponent to then get close to your goal. So what you get from De Zerbi is very much that modern approach. And I think it's worth saying that from a structural point of view, I don't think there's a huge amount of problems with what De Zerbi's doing. As Alex mentioned, there was that shift from a back four to a back three. I think there's also out of possession ideas behind that as well, one of which is the back line being quite exposed. And I think one of the ways you can solve that is by adding an extra player into that back line. Now, that's all well and good in terms of your back line behaviour, but you're removing a player from your high press, right? So if you're going to go man-to-man in those situations where the ball's high up the pitch, you're going to have to do something to sort of fix the structural problem. And the way that we saw that happening is when the opponent would build up on their left-hand side, you would see the wing-back jumping all the way up to the opposition full-back here, and then the centre-back on that side is shifting across. So you end up back in that almost 4-4-2 shape. But the issue here is that if you get your timings wrong, this player can be a long way away from the opposition fullback, and that can then cause these structural problems to occur. But for the most part, I would say, from a top-down point of view, De Zerbi's team at Marseille were playing modern, out-of-possession football. The structures were generally okay. The thing that's important to think about here, I think, is details. And when I say details, what I mean is the players' understanding of their roles, the way that they carry out the actions, and the collective responsibility as well. You can often see it falling to pieces because of that lack of detail.
Yeah, Alex, I'm going to come to you on details in just a second, but from your perspective, Jack, you're looking at a team with a coach that is good in possession, attacking-wise, but those little details, I guess, are missing in that defensive line. Does it feel like a Postecoglou revisit here from Tottenham Hotspur?
I imagine that for the players, it will feel a lot more like Postecoglou than their last two managers, Frank and Tudor. Frank and Tudor were not especially interested, I think, in dominating possession at all. Whereas now, Spurs, in kind of classic Spurs style, they've veered back from the kind of non-possession style all the way back to very proactive possession game. I think the players will like that. I think the fact is good players want to play proactive football. They want to play possession football. And maybe it will remind them more of Postecoglou, even if there are probably differences between the Postecoglou approach and the De Zerbi approach.
Okay, well, let's talk about those details. What have you noticed, Alex?
Well, it was hard not to notice things. Me and John went and watched all of Marseille's shots and goals conceded across De Zerbi's tenure, and the details are consistently off. There are so many examples you can pull from where Marseille are conceding, honestly, quite comedic goals. One that sticks in my mind from earlier this season against Union Saint-Gilloise in the Champions League. If you look at this first screenshot, everyone looks in broadly a good position. On what John was talking about, we've got the front two and the press, you've got the midfield three, and you've got the wing back who's just retreating. He was pressing the fullback, but players moving over to the other side of the pitch. So this is cue to start retreating. And like I said, everyone's in a decent position. Maybe Højbjerg could be a bit closer to this player. But if you fast forward 5 seconds, and suddenly there are 3 players who are completely free to receive the ball. What on earth has happened here, right? Well, I'll tell you, Matt O'Reilly has pressed the goalkeeper, leaving the player he was marking for seemingly no reason, and these 2 players have just not tracked their player. So this allows USG to just play straight through Marseille, one pass into midfield, and they can play another pass out wide. And now we start to see the knock-on effects of this press failing so easily. As this pass comes out wide, the wing-back should ideally be pressing the full-back and the centre-back should be covering him and the player right at the bottom of the screen. But because the press has broken so quickly, they haven't got enough time to mark these players. So instead, they have to hold their line, and this gives the full-back so much space, just carry straight into Marseille's half. And from here, quite predictably, the ball comes inside to this player, USG switch it over until it eventually reaches the winger, who can cut inside, shoot, and he scores. So that's just a nice example of how the details can fall apart right at the top of the high press and the effect that has across the rest of the team, how it leads to a goal.
Well, that's the high press. But what about in deeper areas, John? I'm guessing that's where Spurs will have to be defending in the Premier League a bit more.
Yeah, as we've said, once the high press is broken, you then fall back into a bit more of a zonal block. And I think, again, here we can see examples of the details falling to pieces. When you're in a zonal block, what you're usually wanting to do is make things compact, block passing lanes and make it hard for the opponent to get close to your goal, right? So here against Toulouse, we can see Marseille in that more zonal block. And I think the few things to notice, one is just there's not much compaction here. We've got the front three, there's spaces between them. If they want to play the ball through Toulouse, they can find that pivot player. And then you've got the two midfielders here, one of whom is quite high. And what that means is that even though they're in a block here, the back line, the back five is just completely disconnected from them. And what we end up seeing is I think that back line gets so disconnected from the front line that the back line behaviour becomes really impacted by it. But in this instance, very easy for Toulouse to possess the ball outside the block. The ball's just going to come into the fullback here. And I've just highlighted a few things here. One of the things is pointing. This is something that De Zerbi teams out of possession do all the time, where there's a recognition that there's a problem, but no one really wants to take responsibility for that problem. So here we've got Rabiot saying, okay, the ball's going to come in here, someone else needs to take this player. The central midfielder is going to jump out in this instance. That means that the two central midfielders now, one of them's high, the other one's wide. That's leaving a huge amount of space in the middle. The referee has recognised that, it's taken up a good position. And what we get here then is that lack of compaction. So ball comes out to the fullback is under no pressure, easy for him to play the ball into the channel. And because the back line is so disconnected from the midfield line, it's just so easy to expose them. So the striker actually plays the ball back to the fullback. And what we talked about before with mid-blocks is you want to stop passing lanes, you want to have compaction, you want to make it hard for the opponent to get the ball into dangerous areas. Look how much space the fullback is in. No one's putting him under any pressure because, as we said before, you end up with the wing-back often being pushed deeper in certain phases, and that means that this midfield's responsibility is to close this player down. It doesn't happen. That means he has plenty of space and time to actually find his teammates. And as we can see, I've thrown on a few passing lanes here that are just completely open, that can be used and exploited by Toulouse. In fact, the only player who is blocking the passing lane here is, again, the referee. The referee's having a great game in this one. But again, plenty of options here for Toulouse to actually cause problems. Actually, what happens is the fullback plays it back to the centre-back, who then bounces it back to him. Again, we've got pointing fingers. So Rabiot here recognises that this is a 3v4 overload, which is going to cause problems for Marseille. So he's pointing out to the fullback to tell the midfielder to come across and get it. But obviously when that happens, the player that the midfielder was covering is now a free player. Again, Rabiot has recognised that. He's pointing to his teammates to tell them that there's a player who's going to cause them problems here. And it's worth noting as well the space that the forward can find here as well, because in this instance, the wing-back doesn't want to allow this space to open out for the fullback to get into. And as a result, that means that one of the centre-backs has to come across. It's all leading to lots of problems. Again, we've got another pointing finger here, and with the player on the ball in so much space, it's very easy for him to just bait those two defenders in, play the ball through the middle, striker can run through, cut back and actually play the ball into the box. And then just one more detail here. It's not just the case that this player taking the cross actually has a huge amount of space and time to get the ball into his teammate. Actually, when the ball arrives, his teammate is in a lot of space. I've actually got the reverse angle. Look how much space this striker has to play the header here. Again, little details here where you've got Kondogbia here, who usually plays in midfield, playing in the back line, doesn't get tight enough to his opponent, and therefore it's much easier for Toulouse to actually get this header into the goal. So many little bits of details here. It almost feels like I've had to focus on loads of details because there's so many little things that are going wrong. And as soon as you get lots of little things wrong, that's when big things start to go wrong as well.
I do wonder how this bodes for Spurs, Jack, because we talk about players not taking responsibility. I mean, that's something that a lot of those players at Spurs have been criticised of doing this season fundamentally, not getting to the right position, not pushing their team forward, not driving forward as a team.
Yeah, it does make me think two things. The first is that the players will they can't blame each other if things go wrong, right? The only way out of their current situation is by all pulling together in a way they haven't really done so far this season. The other is that, and I think this will probably be the biggest challenge that De Zerbi will face, is learning the detail required to play this way in such a short period of time. Like, they'll be coming up against managers every week who have been working with their squads for the last few years. And De Zerbi's had about basically a week and a half of training leading into the Sunderland game. So I think this will be one of the most important factors. To what extent will he water down his game? Will he simplify his game? So he's giving his players fewer details to learn if they're going to try and stay up.
Okay, well, Alex, John mentioned backline behaviours. Talk to us about what you've noticed about the backline behaviours that Marseille displayed.
What John's referring to is simply how defenders behave depending on what's happening around them on the pitch. John gave a few examples of backline behaviour within the box. Something else to talk about is backline behaviour within the defensive line outside of the box. So what that might look like, for example, let's say this midfielder's on the ball and this striker's going to make a run in behind. If the backline feel they can catch him offside, that's a cue for them to step up before this pass is obviously played. However, if the striker is in a position where they think actually he could get on the end of the pass and remain onside, that's a cue for something different. The wider defenders, for example, that's their cue to turn sideways, so they're in a good position to run backwards, right? Whereas the closest centre-back, that's going to be his cue to get tight and try and slow the striker down. So this gives the other defenders time to get back and intercept this pass. The problem with Marseille, and if we go back to what Jack was saying about not bringing in too many details, I think the issue with De Zerbi is even if he waters down his game, the defensive side of his coaching, the backline behaviour, just throughout his tenure out with Marseille, it just seems to be really lacking. And there are plenty of goals I could show to demonstrate that, but there's none worse than the goal Marseille conceded against Strasbourg last season. I think this is one of the worst goals you'll ever see conceded at the top level. So this pass is being played into Andre Santos, now of Chelsea. This player is Emmanuel Omega, soon to be of Chelsea, and he's going to look to run in behind and Santos is going to look to pass it to him. How do Marseille defend this? Well, Santos is on the ball and he's allowed to carry it forward and keep carrying it forward with no pressure on him. Omega senses the opportunity to make a run. He makes a run, the pass doesn't find him. Oh no, never mind, it's okay because there's still no pressure on the ball and Omega has enough time to actually get back onside and restart his run. And there's still no pressure on the ball. Obviously, this is very bad from Marseille's midfield. They're not really helping the back line here. But the defenders don't escape criticism either. Let's look at this defender. This is Lilian Brassier, the left-sided centre-back. Now, his cue seems to be to step up and catch Omega offside, except there's a left-back over here playing everyone onside anyway, and Leonardo Bellardi next to him, who's in his eye line, keeping Omega onside as well. So don't really understand the action there. But Bellardi is arguably worse in this instance because he's facing the ball, he's not in a good position to turn and catch Omega if he runs in behind, but he's also not stepping up either, so he's keeping Omega onside. And the result of this backline behaviour is that Santos can play the pass, the pass travels past the midfield line, these defenders are still facing the ball, it's only when it starts to go past them they realise, oh no,
they've just reacted.
I need to start retreating and catch Omega, who is already in a full sprint, he has enough time to run in behind and chip the goalkeeper and score. Like I said, this is the worst example I could pick out, but there are countless examples like this across De Zerbi's tenure at Marseille.
I mean, John, we've seen that Marseille have had a lot of defensive problems and, well, so do Spurs really. So how in reality is this going to work?
Well, exactly. I think this is the big question for me because what we saw from Spurs last game in the Premier League was not necessarily just that they had issues going forward that De Zerbi, I think, will definitely fix. It's also the fact that they conceded 3 goals against Forest and conceded them in ways that show that a lack of attention to detail, which is what we've been talking about with De Zerbi's Marseille. So in this instance, Forest are playing from left to right and the ball is going to go back to the centre-back. Dom Solanke is going to step out. They're in a mid-block here, so they're trying to make things compact. They are putting pressure on the player, so in theory, this is all good. This is what you want to see. The problem is, as soon as Dom Solanke moves out to press Murillo, the centre-back, we've got Morgan Gibbs-White here just moving into space, and you think, okay, this is a mid-block, so the closest player to them, Pat Matar here, is just going to step up and cover him. However, this doesn't happen, and what we get is our first indication of Marseille that we see. This is Pat Matar pointing, saying this guy's going to become a problem, not taking responsibility for it, and actually in the end, it's a very easy pass for Murillo into that space. Morgan Gibbs-White can just receive that ball, turn, and he's got acres of space. And then we start seeing, again, a lack of attention to detail, or at least confusion, I would say, in this instance, between the players, because 3 Spurs players all try and block off Morgan Gibbs-White. And again, this is not about the players not wanting it, as people like to say when often you get these collapses. The issue is that if 3 players try and close off 1 player, there's going to be 3 players elsewhere. And in this instance, the 3 player is in the wide area, and so the ball can just get played out to Callum Hudson-Odoi, who is, as we know, going to try and hit that back line as soon as he possibly can. Now, in this instance, we've got Gibbs-White himself recognising this is a dangerous moment. He's going to get into the box, and Sarr actually does track him. Now you've got Hudson-Odoi, he's going to hit the byline, and I think Sarr here realises that Romero has been slow to track back, so there's no one covering his space, and so he realises this is going to be a problem, especially if the striker runs across the front of Danzo, which is what actually happens. So he recognises the threat here, and he steps forward. The problem is that his teammate doesn't recognise the threat that he's then opening out by stepping forward. And
Free man then.
Yeah, exactly. Morgan Gibbs-White is going to be free. So when Hudson-Odoi hits the byline, it's a pretty easy ball back into Morgan Gibbs-White. Tel has not tracked Gibbs-White in this instance, and so in the end, yeah, it was just a very easy shot on target for Gibbs-White, which it goes straight at the goalkeeper, but because the goalkeeper is so exposed, it just goes straight through him. So again, we're seeing the same sorts of things that we've been talking about with Marseille at Spurs. These, I think, are the issues that Spurs need to fix now. De Zerbi hasn't given any indication that he is going to fix these kind of problems. That's the question for me. Are Spurs going to be defensively good enough in the next 7 games to be able to stay up?
Off the back of that, I think it's worth saying too, when De Zerbi took over at Brighton, he was inheriting a team from Graham Potter that was extremely well coached, right, particularly defensively. When he took over from Marseille, he took over a team that had gone through 3 managers in the previous season, and they basically built a new squad for him. So if anything, if you're holding out hope that maybe De Zerbi's time at Brighton, maybe a bit more solid defensively, is proof that he can do it in the Premier League, I think his time at Marseille is actually more indicative of the level of coaching De Zerbi provides defensively.
I mean, Jack, these two aren't that optimistic. Does Roberto De Zerbi have to change his ideals if he's going to keep Spurs up?
I think he will have to change his ideas a bit. I think that he's coming in such a difficult situation, 7 Premier League games left, only about 10 days of training leading into that, the first of his Premier League games in charge, that he will not be able to give his players the full version, I think, of his game model. I think it would just be too complicated. So I think he will probably have to dilute his ideas a bit. But I actually think the most important thing really right now is not the ideas, it's his capacity to get inside the players' heads and motivate them. That's what Spurs have really lacked this season. They've lacked an idea, they've lacked a purpose, they've lacked a sense that like all players want to be like top players. They want to play proactive football. They want to dominate the ball. They haven't had that this season. And I think you can see that in what's been a fairly obvious drop in the players' motivations and standards this year. And so I think if there's any hope for De Zerbi at Spurs, it's not actually in the tactical ideas. It's in his ability to get into the players' heads, to motivate them, and to get them all pulling in the same direction, which they haven't had for a while.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.